Welcome to Idaho State University Homeland Security and Emergency Management Leadership Insight webinar series. I'm Teresa Connor. I'm Dean of the College of Health and a champion of this terrific Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management degree program. On behalf of ISU, I thank you for joining us. We are honored to have with us today a very special guest, Secretary Janet Napolitano. Welcome, Secretary. Secretary Janet Napolitano is a professor of public policy and director of the Center for Security and Politics at UC Berkeley. A distinguished public servant, Secretary served as the president of the University of California from 2013 to 2020, as the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013, as governor of Arizona from 2003 to 2009, as Attorney General of Arizona from 1998 to 2003, and as U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona from 1993 to 1997. She earned her BS degree in political science from Santa Clara University, where she was a Truman Scholar and the university's first female valedictorian. She received her law degree from the University of Virginia School of Law. As Secretary of Homeland Security, she led the nation's effort to prevent terrorist attacks, secure our borders, respond to natural disasters, and build domestic resiliency. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today.
Thank you, Dean.
Now I'm going to introduce you to our moderator for tonight's webinar, Lori Holeen. Ms. Holeen is an associate professor and the program director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management here at ISU. Ms. Holeen served in local, state, and federal government as a practitioner before moving into academics, and she previously worked in the National Response Coordination Center at FEMA headquarters, where Secretary Napolitano was leading the Department of Homeland Security. I'll turn it over to you, Lori.
Thank you so much, Dean Connor. I appreciate that. Welcome to all of our guests, and we're so happy that you're here with us today. We're very honored to have Secretary Napolitano as our distinguished guest. The Emergency Services Department at ISU is proud to host these webinars, the Homeland Security Leadership Insight webinars. This is our opportunity where we ask leaders to share their knowledge and perspectives with the ISU community. I want to highlight just a couple of administrative items before we get started with today's program. All participants have their audio has been muted, and we have pre-gathered questions from people who submitted those in advance, and that's what we'll be using kind of in a fireside chat style for today's discussion. But we still encourage you to use the Q&A if you have other thoughts and other questions, and we'll do our best to work those in as we have time. So, Secretary Napolitano, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. To set the stage, could you share maybe a little bit about the journey that led to you developing this expertise and your knowledge about Homeland Security?
Sure. So actually, my first exposure to Homeland Security was in the field of domestic terrorism, because when I was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona, Tim McVeigh blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. And he had planned that bombing while he was in Arizona. So my office was responsible for helping to assemble the evidence on the Arizona side of that prosecution. And so that obviously created a lot of interest in me in that topic. And then obviously, as the U.S. Attorney, we were responsible for criminal prosecutions for all border-related crime, drug crime, cartel action, human trafficking, serious immigration violations, and the like. So I became very, very familiar with the operations of the border. That carried over to being State Attorney General, where I had broad both civil and criminal responsibilities. And then when you're a governor, you have not only kind of the prosecution side, as it were, and the investigation side, but you have the management side, because a state like Arizona, you have forest fires, you have floods, you have natural disasters of all kinds. Every governor has to deal with this. And that exposed me to FEMA and working with FEMA, and also to working with communities on disaster response and recovery. and the whole community of first responders who are operational there. And I think it was that blend of experiences, FEMA, the border, domestic terrorism, whatever, that caused President Obama to name me as his first Secretary of Homeland Security. And then, as you know, Lori, DHS covers the gamut. There's almost nothing that happens in the United States that DHS doesn't touch upon.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those connection points between all those different programs. DHS has quite the collection and breadth of different component offices underneath. You brought up a couple things. You brought up the whole community, and I wanted to kind of circle back to that concept again. That was something that I think was originally coined by FEMA administrator at the time, Craig Fugate. And I think it was all really about how it needs to be a whole effort for us to get to community resilience. And I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you feel like we've achieved that, or do you think we're falling short of that societal resilience?
Oh, I think we're much better at it. Not uniformly across the country, but I think it's much better. You know, we learned so many lessons from Katrina, where there was, failure at every level, municipal, state, federal, and it was a terrible crisis for our country to go through, and for the people of New Orleans in particular to go through. But there were lessons learned from that. And then when I became secretary, we brought in Craig as our FEMA director, we really took the view that communities themselves needed to be better educated, better prepared, better able to handle themselves, and people needed to be empowered to in terms of what to do, where to go, how to get help when they needed help, how to know whether they needed help. And so we began kind of a massive kind of reorientation of FEMA in that regard. After Katrina, people just assumed that FEMA was the first responder. They were always going to be the first agency in. And of course, emergency response doesn't happen that way. When you call 911, you're not going to get FEMA. You're going to get your local police or sheriff's department. And so that's where it needs to start.
Yeah, well, that's so great. When you talked about that local, we use that phrase of all disasters start local and they end local, because we use that ladder of support and reach out, to the higher levels of governments where it goes from the local to the state and then up to the federal level for support. So thank you for your feedback on that. How would you describe your leadership style, and how has that helped you navigate through so many, official positions in your career?
Well, you probably have to ask others what my leadership style is, but I think it's a couple of things. I think I'm very direct. I try to be very clear in terms of what my expectations are. I try to set goals for the team. I listen and listen to the people on the team, particularly those who are bringing particular expertise to bear. I don't ask anyone to do anything I wouldn't do myself. It sounds like a cliche, but it's not. It really is leadership by example. And when you're talking about running an agency or department like DHS, that's a 24/7 job because you are dealing with the international environment, the national environment, the state and local environment. You're dealing with the Congress, you're dealing with the White House, you're dealing with the press, all kinds of constituencies come to bear. And so you really are on call consistently and constantly when you're the secretary. It's a challenging job. It's a tough job. But I wouldn't trade that time for anything.
Yeah, well, that's something that I'm noticing too, because I teach strategic planning and budgeting for Homeland Security. That's one of the classes I'm teaching right now. And we look at the DHS budget and brief document. And I have students pick one of the component offices and they have to go through a budget cut. And in the same time frame, we're looking at how challenging it is for Congress to balance their budget. And we always get these short continuing resolutions that kind of kick the can down the road.
Yeah, let me interject there a couple of things. First of all, when I came in as secretary, I came in right at the beginning of President Obama's first term. I was actually confirmed on his inauguration day. That is right at a really hot time during budget season, when the budget has to be submitted to OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. And so my first sets of meetings at DHS were to go through that budget and what had been submitted by the prior administration and what changes we wanted to make, if we wanted to make any. Which was kind of the way when I became a governor, that's what I did. The first thing you've got to master is that budget. That tells you what resources and tools you have to deal with. And over time, as you become more and more familiar with what you've got, as you make those adjustments, as you make those changes, that's really how you implement policy changes.
Yeah, I think that's a great clarification, because you can write a great strategic plan, but if the budget isn't aligned with your strategic plan,
it's just going to sit on the shelf. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great point about the budgets helping implement the priorities. So I want to go back a little bit further in your background. As a female leader and an attorney with some experience, such as representing Anita Hill related to sexual harassment, what are your thoughts about women leaders in predominantly male-dominated professions?
That's an interesting question. When I became U.S. Attorney, I was appointed by President Clinton, and he was actively looking for women to fill non-traditional roles, one of which is being the U.S. Attorney. And the U.S. Attorneys, there are 93 across the country. You have an Office of Assistant U.S. Attorneys, AUSAs. Arizona is one federal district, so it was one office. We had lawyers in Phoenix and lawyers in Tucson, but basically one office. He really reached out to find women who were willing to take on that role, which was there had been very few female U.S. attorneys before then. So when I came in, first of all, I'd never been a prosecutor. I had no criminal law experience, and here I am running an office with 100 career prosecutors, but you learn fast, and you've got to. And I appointed a chief deputy from within the office, which is also another management thing to do, is to promote from within if you can. And she really helped me. When you're the U.S. Attorney, you're working with all these federal agencies. You work with the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the then INS, the Postal Inspector, the Secret Service, the whole alphabet soup. And I would call a meeting for all the local heads of those federal law enforcement agencies, and they were all men. I thought, the first time they came in, I thought, whoa, this is kind of interesting. And then I thought, yeah, but I'm at the head of the table, so I get to chair the meeting. But you've got to, you can't take it for granted. You got to be prepared. You got to be, like I said, I think being plain spoken and direct is important. And then you got to look for opportunities to relate to people outside the work context. So in that vein, I learned they didn't like to talk in meetings, but they like to talk on the golf course. I didn't know how to play golf, so I went and took some lessons, and then I started going to some best ball tournaments and so forth. And then they were chattering away. So
yeah. Well, that's a great piece of advice. That was something that I was gonna follow up with. We're seeing, which I'm very pleased to see, we're seeing more and more females coming in and
For sure.
taking on the discipline and getting their degrees in Homeland Security and emergency management. And I've even looked at some charts and graphics that are showing that the trend is going up. There's more and more women that are being attracted to those kind of emergency management, critical services, helping communities type of positions. So do you have any advice for how to navigate that kind of through, you know, what might be a few uncomfortable moments in times when you're gaining some leadership positions and you might not always have the support you're looking for?
Well, you know, maybe I never had any guff. I never had to take any guff, but I know other women who have, and the way they've handled it is not to take it and just call people on it and say, don't do that, don't say that, that's inappropriate, let's move on. And you're right, Lori. As in many other professions, women are a growing percentage, and it's good to see. So while I may have been one of the first in many of my career iterations, I'm certainly not going to be the last.
Yeah, wonderful. What do you think was the most significant learning curve that you encountered when you were transitioning from your role as the governor in a border state that you mentioned all of those Homeland Security elements, but then when you had to transition to becoming the Secretary of Homeland Security? What was that transition or learning curve like for you?
Yeah, well, I'm going to tell an anecdote from when I was a new governor. Because that was a transition too, going from being an attorney general to being governor. And one Sunday morning, I was actually out playing tennis, and a fellow on my security detail came over and said, your chief of staff needs to talk with you. Well, when you get a phone call from your chief of staff early on a Sunday morning, you know it's not going to be good news. And it turned out that two lifetime life sentence prisoners at our maximum security prison had taken two prison guards hostage, a male guard and a female guard. And they had been able to get them into a tower that was in the middle of the prison yard. And they were secreted there. And the tower was, because it had been built to be impregnable, it was where the prison armory and the prison pharmacy were both housed. And these guys, of course, their original demands were outrageous. You know, they wanted a plane to South America, they wanted millions of dollars, they wanted their convictions expunged, etc. And it was like, no, we're not doing that. We had to bring in, we put the prison on lockdown. We had snipers positioned all around the roof in case they ever came up on the top of the tower. And I gave a shoot to kill order if there were ever a time when they were both available and could be taken out. But they were too smart for that. They never did it that way. One of them would come up and they'd smoke a cigarette on the top, and the other one would be down in the tower with a gun on the head of one of our guards. And it was, as you might imagine, an incredibly tense circumstance, and where lives were really on the line. We brought in the FBI hostage response team. We had our state hostage response team, and we began a process of trying to negotiate a settlement. And my view was, as long as we were talking, we would keep talking. But the pressure kept growing on me and my head of corrections, who was also a woman, by the way. Why aren't you storming the tower? Why aren't you storming the tower? And what people didn't understand was, if we stormed the tower, our guards, our hostages, would be killed. The two inmates would be killed. But they had such armament in the tower that the people doing the storming, there would be injury or death. So that was going to always be a last option. So after a week, they let the male hostage go, but they kept the female hostage. And you can imagine the conditions that she was under. But we finally negotiated a deal where on Super Bowl Sunday, if we provided them with a steak dinner and a six-pack, they would come out after the Super Bowl. Now, normally you don't let alcohol in a prison, but in this case, it seemed to me a reasonable accommodation. And we didn't know whether this was going to work or not, but it did. Game ended, they came down, and Lois, the female guard, was immediately put on a gurney, and they flew her to the roof of a hospital in Phoenix. And myself and Dora Shiro, who was our head of corrections, we met her there as she was being unloaded from the helicopter to be taken into the hospital. And she grabbed our arms and she just said, "Thank you for not storming the tower. They would have killed me." And they would have. That was a real exposure to some of the stakes that can be created in these situations. And the key thing is have a good team, know what your values are, know what your expectations are, and just be tough, hold on to them. And if you have to adjust in the middle, make an adjustment. But that was a real lesson learned. So when I moved to DHS, now DHS, you've got natural disasters, you've got terrorism, you've got cybersecurity, border security, TSA, the whole shebang. But I often hearken back to those 2 weeks of dealing with the prison hostages.
Yeah, when you were describing that scenario, I kept thinking about one of the things that we teach at our graduate level is about systems thinking and nonlinear ways to look at scenarios, all of the interconnections that exist, and highly complex environments, which of course, most Homeland Security related environments are highly complex. And we can't always think that the script that we have or the plan that we have developed is going to play out and meet those needs exactly. So the emergent practice or getting a sense from those inmates that they would respond to that offer of the Super Bowl and a beer, wow, that's just proves that point that sometimes you have to deviate from an otherwise scripted plan to look at the current environment.
Yeah, we didn't really have a plan for how to deal with prison hostage situation. So,
Yeah.
we were kind of moving along, making it up as we went along, but we knew, and we were very clear about what our goal was. Our goal was to get particularly our guards, our corrections officers out without serious injury or death. The inmates, fine. They're now serving their life sentences in prisons outside of Arizona, but they were dealt with. But yeah, that was a really tense time, and that was the first time I really experienced the power of media, because you had all this kind of talk radio. And all these guys, calling in and basically implying that I wasn't storming the tower because I was a female. I was not strong enough to storm the tower, not realizing that you had to actually be stronger not to storm the tower. So that was an interesting introduction to that phenomenon.
Yeah, no, those are excellent points. So you're talking about a lot of high pressure situations. And so I wanted to ask you about do you have a decision-making process or a style in these high pressure situations that involve national security? I mean, obviously, it's probably hard to get all the information you may need. So how do you approach that when you need to make a decision?
It depends on the circumstances, and it depends in part in terms of how much time you have. You can have a crisis situation like the underwear bomber on Christmas Day of 2009. This was a fellow named Farouk Abdulmutallab, who had managed to get on a plane that took off from Amsterdam. And when they entered they was going to Detroit. And when they entered US airspace, he had explosives hidden in his underwear, which he tried to detonate. Fortunately, the detonation wasn't all that successful, and the other passengers, got a hold of him and put him down, etc. But I was in California then, and my team was spread all over the country because we hadn't had a day off since the election. So it was our first kind of rest period. The president himself was in Hawaii. But But when you have somebody try to take down a commercial airliner, that just brings back all kinds of memories of 9/11, and then it raises all kinds of questions. I mean, how did he manage to get on a plane? What was the security protocol? Was the security protocol at Amsterdam and at foreign airports, was it different than at US airports? Turns out it was. What did we do? What would we do? We needed to figure out, were there any other planes in the air that had somebody else that was getting ready to blow up their underwear? We had to figure out, the background of this guy, where he got this explosive, how he got trained, who he was working for. And it all had to go super, super fast. So sometimes on those things, the key thing, we had a process in DHS called a nickel call. Nickel is an acronym, and don't ask me what this stands for. It's just called a nickel call. But we assembled a nickel call on a secure line, and then I was on the phone with the White House. And we were working through it, but really on a Christmas Day. It was on a a really fast basis. And one of the other things we needed to do was, once we were confident, and we did gain confidence pretty early, that there was nobody else on a plane for whom we had any derogatory information or any intel at all that they were part and parcel of some kind of master plot. The US airline industry, that's a heavy travel period. People are traveling over the holidays. And so to manage that and to persuade people they would be safe if they flew, and then to deal with all the reverse engineering on Napolitano. So the first thing was, what do you do day one, hour one, then hour 6, and so forth during the first day. And then we had to work our way through putting together, the whole scenario over time. So that's an example of one where you have to make decisions quickly. And that means you've got to have people around you who are knowledgeable, who are smart, who know how to bring relevant information to you. You don't have time to read a long briefing paper. You don't have time. And the information, as the hour goes by, the hours go by, it changes, right? You never have perfect information. You never have complete information. Yeah. So this notion that you can kind of sit around a table and know exactly all the pieces of the puzzle and how they fit together, et cetera, that doesn't happen that way. So you've got to make the best judgment you can with the facts that you have, and then be able to adjust as the facts change. You have to verify the facts, because misinformation starts flooding the zone too. People hear this, or I saw this, or da. And then it turns out, no, that's not accurate. So you got to clear that up. So, so that's an example of kind of a fast moving crisis. Other crises are longer term, right? You really do have more time to think and plan, and do something that's more broad ranging in a way.
Yeah, well, what do you think is one of those examples? Just, do you have a thought?
Yeah, well, for example,
I'm wondering that a lot of times we're thinking about climate change and some of the changes that are happening in the environment that are starting to demonstrate themselves in our current environment. And
that's a really good example, because there's so much happening now that's related to climate change, from the health of our forests to sea level rise to changing weather patterns. And so beginning to incorporate that information, that science, into your planning for disaster response and recovery is really a good example of kind of more long-term planning that you can do.
Yeah, it's kind of a slower moving freight train that, you know, we still have to not ignore it, but it may not be as rapidly evolving as some of these other threats that we face.
Right, right. Now, one of the more difficult crises we had to deal with when I was secretary was the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. This was BP had done deep drilling over a mile below the surface of the Gulf for oil. And the whole thing started when the oil rig itself blew up. And initially it was a Coast Guard issue because they were out there rescuing oil rig workers who had been thrown into the water, et cetera, et cetera. But then over time, we began to see that oil from the bottom begin to, flow into the Gulf and to the surface, and then begin to go on shore in Louisiana and Mississippi and so forth. That was a very complicated disaster, required many federal agencies, but because it was designated by the president as a spill of national significance, the secretary of DHS, in a way, became the team leader, and DHS became the team leader of coordinating the federal response. And so I named the Coast Guard commandant as the on-scene commander. So usually in these kinds of things, you have somebody on scene and then somebody back at headquarters. We started off having twice daily calls with the actual cabinet secretaries of the cabinet agencies involved. So we had the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of Energy, the head of the EPA, Carol Browner, who was designated from the White House. And we would go through what each of us, we would hear from the on-scene commander, Thad Allen, and then we would talk about what the plan was for the next 12 hours, who was going to do what were some of the difficult decisions that needed to be made. One of the difficulties there was dealing with the states, because the state governors were all in an uproar, and some of them were more difficult to deal with than others. I'll just put it that way. And also putting together, moving the number of people to the Gulf area to work with local communities, to work with fishermen and so forth, whose livelihoods were threatened. That was a massive effort. And then to assemble the fleet of vessels that could skim the oil off the surface of the Gulf. We were bringing ships down from Alaska, from Africa. I mean, they were coming in, but it takes time. And so people get impatient, but they were moving and we were moving as fast as we could. And then the fundamental problem was British Petroleum, who owned the pipeline, had no disaster plan to speak of. And they had no instrumentation on their drilling mechanism, so that we could tell, what the kind of pressure readings were that they were getting underneath the oil, underneath the surface. And you're talking about a mile underneath the surface. I mean, really deep. And there were all these theories that, well, let's just put a cap on top of the on the surface, on top of where it's coming out. The problem there is that forces the oil to go back down, and then it goes under the surface of the Gulf, and then instead of coming out in one place or two places, it's coming out of 1,000 different places. And so that was very, very difficult to deal with. And Secretary of Energy Steve Chu was very helpful, and he actually went down to Houston to the BP headquarters and sat with them, and they worked through some of the science on that, on how to get that thing stopped.
Yeah, that was definitely a really complex issue. Still had quite the environmental impacts, I'm sure. So let's turn our focus a little bit more towards kind of current day. And so we got some questions in advance, and I want to ask you this one. Securitization of important policy initiatives occur from both sides of the political spectrum. Do you have any solutions that citizens could be pushing for to impede that?
Yeah, what does the questioner mean by securitization? Do you know?
I think we're talking about policy initiatives, wanting to make sure we can actually get something into law. that can help us with some of those aspects of needing to, have better security for certain aspects, and looking at kind of the current political environment that we've been seeing. And I think that this question is trying to strike that balance of what is the citizen role of potentially getting involved in the way that the politics are playing out that may or may not be contributing to us making forward progress on some policy level sides.
Well, that's a $64,000 question, if ever there were one in this era, in this day and age.
Yeah.
There's lots of avenues for citizen engagement. You can write letters to members of Congress. You can try to go meet with them when they're home in their districts, meet with their staffs, educate their staffs, write letters to the editor, post on social media, try to create a sense of this is what the public wants, this is what the public needs. Disaster response is the kind of the paradigm for what should be a nonpartisan issue, because the obligation is to keep people safe, and when something bad happens, to help them recover as quickly and smoothly as possible. Easier said than done, I might say.
Yeah.
But trying to create that kind of nexus, and then voting is ultimately the citizen's power.
Yeah, so that brings us to another question, which has to do with how polarized the country is right now when it comes to the current political divide. And we anticipate, or I think we are all kind of wondering and seeing that this is going to continue throughout 2024 as we approach the election for this year. And it will likely potentially lead to some additional violence, regardless of which person is going to be elected president. Do you have any suggestions for regular folks as to how we can maybe reduce that polarization that's occurring, which seems to be baked into our politics?
Yeah, polarization. I think we live in pendulums, right? And we're at a far end of the polarization pendulum. And I think it'll swing back. It may swing back, unfortunately, because we face some kind of real national crisis, like a 9/11. God help us, we won't, but those kinds of things tend to bring people together. But I think in terms of election security, now the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, is part of DHS. And one of the key infrastructures that it is responsible for is the election infrastructure. Now, elections are conducted by states. Every state has its own rules. And actually in the states, it's usually done locally in the county level or the municipal level. So it's really an example of a very fragmented organization. But we know some things, like we know, for example, that particularly some of our foreign adversaries have figured out that they can kind of poke at divisions in U.S. society by spreading information, disinformation, misinformation, and try to keep people, at each other's throats in a way. And that's a problem that we're going to be dealing with, I think, for a long time, until we figure out a better way for people to ascertain what's accurate information from what's not accurate information. And then in terms of the actual mechanics of voting, making sure that the actual mechanics are done securely so that people can trust them. And I think one of the unfortunate outcomes of 2020 is that many people lost trust in the mechanics of voting, in the mechanics of counting the vote. And even though there were a lot of court cases, I think there were 61 court cases, none of which found any alteration in any vote or anything that happened that would have affected the ultimate outcome. nonetheless, it really undercut people's trust in the system and in the election workers who have to manage the system. And I hope we could get that back.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think we're definitely going to see some flare-ups. We had another speaker who came in and talked about catalytic events and how having something that pulls and divides can create a more fragile environment where people act out even more. So, you know, being able to maybe diffuse some of those situations hopefully will be some capabilities that we can put into place. So I have one more question I'm going to ask before we're going to check in and see if we have any questions from our attendees. And just as a reminder, if you have a follow-up question, or if you have a question you would like to pose to Secretary Napolitano, you can use the Q&A feature and submit your question there. But so here's one more question for us to get your thoughts on. Do you have any recommendations for rural jurisdictions that have limited personnel that are dedicated to managing natural hazards and human-caused incidents?
Yeah, rural is tough. And Arizona has two largely urban counties, Maricopa, where Phoenix is, and Pima, where Tucson is. And the other 13 counties of the state are very rural. And we also have Indian country, which is some of the most rural and isolated parts of the United States. And the issue of resources and resource availability and training and capacity, et cetera, it's a real problem. You know, one of the things we tried to do in Arizona was to encourage young people from rural areas to go into this field and to go home after they went to ASU, Arizona State, or U of A, or wherever, to go home and contribute in this fashion to their communities. We did a lot of training at the state level so that the state kind of bore the cost of the training, and we would financially support some of the poorer counties in being able to send personnel to those trainings. And then in rural areas, you know, don't forget the National Guard. Every governor has a National Guard. They're well resourced, they're well trained, and when things get really bad and you really need help, the governor can call out the Guard.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are a good point. I'm gonna check in with Professor Mike McKiddish. Do we have any questions, Mike, that we'd like to bring forward? I'm not sure if I'm just gonna keep moving forward. He can let us know if he's got any questions for us to ask. So let's take it in a different direction too. And I know that you've got some thoughts and ideas about this. How do you think artificial intelligence will change the Homeland Security and emergency management ecosystems, opportunities, and challenges?
Oh, I think AI is gonna, as it develops and becomes more and more ubiquitous, it's gonna change so much in U.S. society. But in terms of emergency management, first of all, predictive analytics, predictive AI is going to give us much better tools in which to get ahead of particularly a natural disaster, even before we know, even now, that we'll be able to target and identify places much earlier in order to deploy and get resources in position and tell people, you know, this is what we're seeing, and this is what we want to prepare for. This is what you need to prepare for. Again, going back to that individual empowerment theory. I think that it will help us in the U.S. intelligence community be able to better detect patterns of behavior and misbehavior for foreign adversaries that are planning to do to take action against U.S. citizens and against U.S. citizens in the United States. I think that'll be a massive improvement in our overall capacity and capability. And I think other technologies are going to become more available. For example, I'm at the University of California. We've done terrific work on forest fire and on early fire detection and so forth. Before these, while these fires are 1 acre fires, before they become 50 acre fires or 500 or 50,000 acre fires. Those new technologies will become more and more useful. And then new technologies can help in disaster response. For example, if I were running FEMA today, I would start a whole program on the use of digital currency, crypto, in crisis and disaster response. People need cash, they need money, and getting the cash and ATMs and whatever can be a real problem. If you're in a community that's been wiped out by a hurricane or a tornado or what have you, crypto moves money fast, moves it automatically, and if you use the right source, it's safe. So I think those kinds of developments will only improve disaster response and resilience.
Yeah, those are some compelling ideas that I'm sure there's going to be a lot of communities that are going to have to try to figure out how to work in that kind of space. But I think the potential of where that could go is amazing. So hopefully some of the people that are studying and academics and folks that are maybe conducting some research in those areas will have some insights for us.
Right. And then, Lori, as you said, the impact of climate and climate change, that's already affecting natural disasters in an immense way. That's only going to grow. And trying to stay ahead of that, it affects things like, as I mentioned, weather patterns, sea level rise, fire, the rest. It affects immigration. There's a worldwide movement of peoples for many reasons, but many of them are moving in part because their livelihoods have been destroyed by changing climate. So, building in and thinking about how it's likely to manifest itself, but also how it's going to affect our first responders. If you're dealing with a natural disaster and the temperature is going to be 115 degrees and not 100 degrees or 90 degrees, that's a big difference. In terms of how you gear up, what you wear, how you make sure you get water, etc. Those changes are happening now.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to check in with Mike McKiddish and see if we've got some questions floating in from the audience. Mike, are you available to join us?
Just have one question, so I just kind of want to remind everybody that the Q&A, if you have questions, please post your questions in the Q&A. So just one question right now. The Polaris Project, a private non-governmental organization, holds all the data for human trafficking hotline. Recently, over half the AGs have come out against Polaris for not sending human trafficking leads, cries for help, to law enforcement. What should be done about this?
Well, I'm not familiar with that, so you're hitting me cold. I guess my first question would be, why aren't they sending the leads? What is the risk? What are they trying to? What is the danger of tipping off law enforcement? And then trying to see if you can mitigate that or deal with that. There's got to be some reason. As you say, it sounds totally illogical and wrong, but my experience is there's usually something that underlies that, or something that's happened in the past, a bad episode in the past. Maybe somebody's identity was revealed that shouldn't have been revealed, that sort of thing. My gut would be to reach out to Polaris and say, look, this doesn't make any sense to us. Why is this happening, and what can we do to make it better?
Yeah, I actually see a couple other questions that came in before that one, Mike. I'm not sure if you hadn't seen those, but if you don't mind, I want to ask this one. It's a pretty overarching question here that came in from one of our professors, actually. What in your experience is the top Homeland Security and emergency management threat or risks to the U.S. currently?
Oh, it's hard to rack and stack them that way. I mean, they're myriad, there are many. But I think one thing, if you kind of back up and think about it, one is the diminution of trust in our society. People don't trust the government, they don't trust the media, they don't trust politicians, they don't trust each other. They don't trust universities, they don't trust teachers, they don't trust school. I mean, you see it in lots of different things, but in emergency management, where that comes into play is people don't trust what they're being told. So if they're being told, you know what, this hurricane is coming, you got to get out of there, you got to evacuate. If they think, that's baloney, or that's just so and so, and he's a Democrat, what does he know? Or he's a Republican, what does he know? That can be life-threatening. Yeah, if you're told that this is where you can go to find out about FEMA relief and state relief and where the Red Cross is going to be, etc. If you don't trust that, and you say, I'm going to do it myself, I'm going to go off on my own, that's going to make you less capable, less resilient. And if whole communities don't do that, that really undercuts our overall community responsibility. How we restore trust, how we ensure that, when people get on their phones, you get all kinds of information, right? You get, and people go to websites that they agree with or don't agree with, but we need some trusted sources of information that people will use and can deploy.
I guess, speaking of technology, can you speak to the use of drones, robotics, and other technology in both emergency management and defense operations? What's the future look like?
Oh, I think drones are actually an improvement. They give you tremendous visual capability, particularly in remote or rural areas. We were talking about rural areas before, Lori. The technology just keeps getting better and better. And they're cheap. That's the other thing. They're not, it's a lot easier to have a drone to give you visualization than helicopters. You could use your helicopters for other things. So I'm a big believer in drones. Now, internationally, they're used a lot of different ways. We see them on the battlefield a lot, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and we're going to see more and more of that. They have some limitations. They have distance limitations, they have time of flight limitations, they have weight bearing limitations, but those are only going to get better and better as well. So I think drones will be an integrated and integral part of our military arsenal, not just now, but in the future.
Now, one more question, and then I'll throw it back to Lori. Considering the pace of climate change and water scarcity, especially in the West, you believe that it'll become a national security issue?
It could. So I lived in Arizona for 25 years, and we get a lot of our water from the Colorado River. The Colorado River is very depleted. In fact, the states that are part of what's called the Colorado River Compact are now involved in complicated negotiation in terms of how to reduce the allotment. The states, particularly the lower basin states, Arizona, California, Nevada, take from the river. The fact of the matter is the population in those states grew exponentially more than the supply, and the supply of water went down. So Phoenix is millions of people. Los Angeles, my heavens, is one of the largest cities, might be the second largest city in the United States. So that will be a concern, but it will also affect agriculture, right? Because agriculture uses a lot more water than residential use is. And so one of the things they're going to have to do, I think, is fallow some more agricultural land in these affected areas. That will affect food availability, that'll affect prices, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of see that coming. And in a way, that is that economic ag kind of security thing is a security issue as well.
All right, thank you. Lori, back to you, and then maybe if we have time at the end, we can ask a few more.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to ask a little bit, you touched on the water sector and some of the criticality of those natural resources. Given how the increasing interconnectedness of critical infrastructure globally, how do you see the role of international cooperation evolving to effectively tackle cybersecurity challenges when so many of those attacks are happening and stemming from other countries?
Right. Cyber is really complicated. So when I started as secretary in 2009, I spent maybe 10% of my time on cyber related matters. By the time I left toward the end of 2013, it was 40% of my time. And it's complicated in part because it is, by definition, it crosses borders, and because it depends on networks, and you find one weakness in the network and that gets exploited, and then et cetera, then you have the whole domino effect, the cascading effects. And then you have new crimes that are being committed. Ransomware, for example. The Colonial Pipeline episode a few years ago is a good example. Critical infrastructure, cyber attack, and all of a sudden you had a whole portion of the United States that didn't have gas. So how we deal with this, we have to deal with it better domestically, much less internationally. But bringing all the nations of the world together to create common protocols and security things, whatever, I think is unrealistic. I don't think that's going to happen. But we can work closely with our partners and allies in creating standards that we mutually enforce. And we can work closely with our partners and allies in exchanging intelligence and information. And we can work closely with the private sector that controls the overwhelming bulk of the nation's infrastructure in terms of what they need to do and the standards they need to meet to be more cyber secure. But we get a lot of benefits from cyber, don't get me wrong, and we keep innovating in this space. I think that's great, but there's certainly risk that attends it.
Yeah, it's definitely no easy answers on some of those, and the threats seem to be evolving faster than we can generate the people with the expertise to fill those jobs that we need.
That's why we need universities, right?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Okay, let's talk a little bit maybe about radicalization and extremism. What are your thoughts about targeted violence and the rise of extremism that we've seen in the United States?
Well, the United States has gone, this is not the first period in our history where we've had radical extremism. We had a whole period in the early 1900s of radical anarchists bombing and so forth. We had, in a way, you could consider the McCarthy era as an example of extremism. We had the whole rise of vigilante and militia groups in the 1990s. We had some environmental groups that were very militant and violent, Earth First, for example. So, this is not the first time, but I think the difference now is it seems to me there's more of them. And I'm talking domestically now. We can talk internationally in a moment, but domestically now there's more. And social media enables individuals to connect more. So whereas in the past you might have 2 or 3 guys who kind of got together and decided we're going to blow this up or we're going to blow that up, etc. Now, you get on a particular website or a chat site or whatever, and all of a sudden you're not alone. And it's not just you and your buddies. It's, this whole group. And then you start spreading these conspiracy theories and so forth. It's a very big problem for law enforcement. Because, the First Amendment controls domestically and people can say what they want, and no matter how kind of dumb or whatever it is, they can, they're entitled to do it. Our Constitution protects it. So how does law enforcement tell when somebody is moving from just talk and boasting and all that kind of stuff into actual plotting and concrete movement toward committing a violent act? And I think law enforcement has to get much better at that. And actually AI may be helpful in that, because AI is, one of the things AI does is help you see patterns. And that could be a real assistance to law enforcement. International terrorism, it seems like we put down one group, another one develops. We had Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s. Then we have Al-Shabaab, and we have ISIS. Now we have any number of groups. And, that depends, their rise is a complicated phenomenon. It's partially derives from cultural context, economic context, geopolitical context. And, the whole notion is, from a Homeland Security perspective, is how to make sure none of those actors can pose a direct threat to U.S. persons.
Yeah, I wanted to touch base maybe a little bit also about, what are your thoughts about the role or the elements of mental health that could be something that we're seeing contribute to acts of violence, particularly possibly that are playing out in our schools, which are where our most vulnerable populations are at?
Yeah, mental health, again, is a tough thing. And again, this is an area where I think AI may be very helpful for us to help us identify earlier people who are not only suffering from mental illness, but suffering from mental illness that is leading to becoming, for example, a mass shooter or a school shooter and so forth. The whole issue of guns in our society really divides people. And it's really too bad, because to me, there's a role for the Constitution and there's also a role for common sense, right? Is everyone entitled to have an AR-15? Why? For what purpose? Everybody's entitled to have a weapon, but can there be reasonable limitations on the kind of weapon, or at least the background check and the training and so forth of someone who is purchasing such a weapon? And then the role of mental health and all of that is inextricable.
Yeah, I think we're all looking for, what the right combination of solutions are, but it's possible that every community is going to have a slightly different recipe of how they're going to have to work through that, depending on the social cohesion that exists in those environments.
Well, and one of the evolving schools in emergency response is emergency response to mass shootings, be that at a shopping center, a place of worship, a school. How do you respond? Hopefully not like Uvalde, but how do you respond effectively? Save lives, and then how do you help a community heal after something like that? It's devastating, particularly for small communities where people know each other, and it's just a level of violence that affects everybody.
Yeah, definitely. Are you doing okay on time? I'm wondering if we could head back and do a few more questions from the audience, if that's okay with you.
Sure, fire away.
Okay, come on back in, Mike, and see what else we got.
Sure. Just even going off of your last statement, what happened with Uvalde and the loss of trust, I guess. How can DHS and other federal agencies, what can they do to help get that trust back?
I think community engagement. I think when people talk with each other and they know each other, that really that is not technical. It's whatever, but I think it helps. It's really hard to demonize somebody you've actually spoken with and talked to. And where DHS is concerned, now, of course, when people think of DHS, they think of the border, and the border is a big problem. I'm not going to underestimate that. The numbers are simply not sustainable. But there, we really need the political process to help, to provide DHS with more resources, to provide the immigration courts with more resources, and to have an effective, strong policy that's still consistent with our values.
Awesome. And jumping ahead to something that's currently just happened, can you, in your opinion, what went wrong with the fires in Hawaii, and how can we avoid the outcomes in the future from that?
Yeah, Mike, I haven't read any of the after action reports on what happened on Maui. It was terrible. It was terrible to see. And if you've ever been there, it was, it was awful, particularly for the people who live there. I think, if you're doing an after action report there, first thing you have to understand or need to understand is what caused the fire, why did it spread so quickly, what was the process of alerting people, was that effective? Was the emergency response well organized and well conducted? Were they able to limit the fire effectively? And then you've got to go into longer term response and resilience. How do you rebuild a community that's been devastated in such an important area of the community? And I'm sure that there'll be, I think they're probably already after action reports now. I just haven't myself seen them, and I'm sure it'll be studied for a long time.
Yeah, going along with that, it's been, one of the members of the audience is a specialist that works for FEMA, and one of the things that they were saying was, application response time and extension to projects take far too long. In some cases, 10, 15, 20 years. How in your opinion, can we speed up this recovery process for survivors so they can get back to normal life as soon as possible?
If I ran the world, I would put some real juice into really trying to simplify and streamline the FEMA process, to be able to have people go to one place, fill out one piece of paper, and get the resources they need to begin their rebuilding process, and for communities to be able to do the same. I think speed really matters. When your house is down or your community is down, it just can't sit there for a year or 2 years. You can't expect people to live with blue tarps, for months and months and months on end. So I think we can do better.
Yeah, and then I think a favorite question for all of us that are in academia, what should DHS and FEMA do to develop the next generation of emergency managers and Homeland Security professionals?
Well, I think programs like this are really great, because you're already tapping into people who are interested. I think communications and training, and consistency and persistence. I mean, not just, okay, we're going to do this training once a year. No. It's going to be easily accessible, and consistent and persistent. So it finally gets into people's heads, and becomes part of the kind of the context of people's lives and the community. You don't want people living in fear. But people live in fear when they lack knowledge. If they have knowledge, then they can adjust, they can operate, they can figure out what they need to do. And I think we need to empower and educate just more people altogether.
And let's see, there's another question that has to deal with the current issue of what's happening on our southern borders, and especially in Texas as we speak. And to that, can you just speak? He's got a lot of things in here about the border. Can you speak to what's happening on the southern border? I know you spent a lot of time in Arizona and as DHS secretary dealing with border issues. Can you speak to what's going on with the border and how DHS might be looking at that, and what our current laws are in effect, and how we might be able to prevent some of the things that are happening with people on our southern border?
Well, I think first of all, the mix of people at the borders has changed. So in the 1980s, the 1990s, it was primarily young Mexican males coming into the country looking for work, and then a certain small percentage, but a certain percentage with the drug trade. Now the mix is Central America, China, Haiti, Cuba, and Mexico, but it's a whole mix, and many more women and children, families coming. And you have to appreciate how desperate you have to be to leave your home and make that journey and get to our border. It's just a human thing. But it does create a vulnerability, because we can't know who all is coming into the country. Drug trafficking is a problem. Fentanyl is a problem. Human trafficking is a problem. And I think it requires a real whole of government response. We need to be working with the countries of origin where people are coming from, to see what can be done to limit the incentive for people to have to leave. That's kind of called dealing with the root causes. Work particularly with the country of Mexico, which is a transit country and a source country. When people get to the border, we need the ports of entry to be able to process people quickly. And when people are picked up between the ports of entry, we need a way to immediately, effectively adjudicate whether they may be entitled to asylum, and if they're not, to remove them. Say, look, this is our law. You don't meet the standards of our law. You can't come in. But to adjudicate those claims, that's where one of the big problems has been, because the immigration courts are not part of DHS. They're part of the Department of Justice. And they have been underfunded for years and years and years, and this has allowed this huge backlog to develop. So now when people make their initial showing at the border that they may be entitled to asylum, it's called the credible fear showing, then they're going to be in the country 3, 4, 5 years. I think the backlog in the immigration courts is in the millions now. It's ridiculous. And so that needs an immediate major push to clean that up, clear the backlog, and then keep current. But from a Homeland Security perspective, it's a crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's a fiscal crisis, it's a security crisis. And you got to deal with it. It's a crisis, and it requires an all-of-government response.
So do you think the National Guard should be utilized for that response? And if so, who should control that? Should the states be controlling their National Guard, or is that something that should be federalized at that point in time?
Well, the way the law works is that the border is federal. Now, when I was governor, I deployed our National Guard to the border, but they did backup work. They didn't do actual patrolling, whatever, but they helped do the backup paperwork and so forth, so that the agents had more time to actually be on the line. But you want to be very careful about deploying military assets in an immigration context. We're not at war with Mexico. We're not at war with these countries of Central America. Our military, we need them, but we need them preparing in the Pacific. We need them in the Middle East. We need them other places. And it's not their role nor their function to be immigration guards. So I think that would be a false hope if we were and once you start doing that, it's really hard to back up the bus and not do it anymore, even though those very valuable military assets, there's a greater need for them elsewhere.
Just one last question. The EU recently passed legislation impelling social media companies to report terrorism and other threats or face heavy fines. Should the U.S. adopt this type of legislation?
Yeah, I think it's worth considering. Again, you're going to run into First Amendment problems in the United States because government cannot enact a law that inhibits or limits the right of free speech. And so how you tell the difference on social media between real terrorist plotting that should be reported versus, loose talk and braggadocio, et cetera. That's a hard thing. But I think we ought to watch and see how the EU how it's working, and if it's working well and they're getting useful intelligence, et cetera, we ought to look at it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Secretary Napolitano. And Lori, back to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the questions. So I think we're kind of getting to the point where we're going to wrap things up. And, Secretary Napolitano, we just thank you so much for the time you had with us today. Are there any closing comments? Is there anything that we didn't ask you that you would like to share with us as we're getting ready to wrap it up?
No, I think it was a pretty broad-ranging discussion. Thank you. But for those who have been listening to the webinar, I would say that national security, Homeland Security it's great work. It's great work as a career. It's great work for your communities, for your country, and I encourage people to really go into this field.
Great. Well, thank you so much. On behalf of Idaho State University and the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Program, we want to say thank you to our audience for taking the time to attend. And thank you so much, Secretary Napolitano, for your wisdom and sharing your insights with us. I'm going to just kind of quickly, as we wrap up, share my screen for just a heads up. That we have a couple of upcoming leadership insight webinar topics that are coming up. We will have a speaker from CISA who will be talking with us on March 12th. We've got David Breedman, who is the founder of the K through 12 school shooting database, who will be speaking. We have Kara Gronborg. She's with the National Football League Intelligence, working on the Super Bowl and special events. She'll be speaking with us in April. And then we have Sasha Larkin, who will be with us from Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. We have a couple of other ones that are in the works. We haven't pinned those down yet, but Pacific Northwest National Labs will be having a session with their national security folks. And then also the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, will have Calvin Terdata, the director of the Superfund and Emergency Management in Region 10. So look for those opportunities, as we'll be sharing those out. And with that being said, I'm going to close down the webinar. And again, thank you so much, Secretary Napolitano.
Thank you, Lord. Take care.
Have a good night.